Money is power, yet power is nothing if it is not wielded through dependence. Consider the world as a chessboard, each man a piece, each fortune a potential instrument. Wealth, without leverage over others, is mere abundance. It is the difference between owning a coin and owning the coin's consequences. True command is exercised not in the hoarding of gold, but in the arrangement of those who must touch it to survive. When others rely upon what you control, the invisible chains tighten, and your will becomes law without declaration. Observe the anxious merchant, the indebted client, the employee who cannot dream beyond their payroll. Each exists within the architecture you have silently constructed, and within that architecture, your power resides, unseen but absolute. Money is a tide. You can float upon it, but greater still is the tide that lifts the lives of others at your discretion, for therein lies influence that fear and respect alone cannot purchase. Every transaction, every extension of credit, every opportunity granted or withheld is a subtle act of governance, a whisper of dominance. Those who understand this do not speak of charity or generosity. They speak in terms of leverage, in terms of control, in terms of inevitability. You are not their master in a casual sense. You are the axis upon which their decisions turn, the silent hand that guides their ambitions, the invisible judge whose nod or denial shapes their world. Wealth, divorced from this awareness, is fragile. The man who amasses without thought of dependency clutches sand, and when the wind rises, it slips through his fingers. To command through currency is to command through necessity, and necessity is a force as immutable as the tides, as relentless as the passage of days, and as visible only to those who know where to look. Every contract signed, every favor granted, every moment of seeming generosity is a stone placed in the edifice of control. Money is not the power itself, it is the conduit, the instrument, the tool through which the architecture of influence is assembled. The shrewd understand that it is not the coin in your pocket that ensures your dominion, but the measure to which others depend upon the coin in your pocket. Observe the man who despises reliance. He will never grasp authority beyond himself. Observe the man who cultivates it. He molds entire networks, entire cities, entire ambitions, with the simple act of controlling access. To control dependence is to control desire, to shape fear, to craft obedience without threat. It is an art performed in silence, in transactions invisible to the casual observer, in gestures so subtle they pass as happenstance. The wise distribute scarcity and abundance with equal deliberation, for each is a lever in the machinery of compliance. Those who beg for loyalty or trust are weak. Those who cultivate reliance without declaration are strong. Understand this distinction, and you understand that money is not merely currency, it is the fulcrum upon which human behavior pivots. In the theaters of commerce, politics, and society, nothing is more potent than the ability to be both desired and indispensable, to be the silent architect of necessity. Those who feel free, who need nothing, who possess independence, resist control. Those who need, who rely, who cannot escape your provision, act as instruments of your will, whether consciously or unconsciously. Money, then, is not a prize. It is the means by which you compose the obedience of others. To wield it effectively is to become invisible yet omnipresent, to shape outcomes without proclamation, to set events in motion with the discretion of a hand that never trembles. The state, the firm, the social circle, the family, each is a lattice of dependency waiting to be mapped, measured, and directed. The ruler, the strategist, the financier, the modern architect of influence, he knows that his currency is only as potent as the web of reliance it spins. Those who dismiss this principle are blind. They believe wealth equals control, when in truth, control is built on the acceptance of need, on the reliance others place upon what they cannot provide themselves. To command money is to command attention, to command desire, to command action, but to command the dependence of others through money that is power in its purest, most unassailable form. The distinction is quiet, almost imperceptible. Yet it divides the men who survive from the men who dictate, the fortunes that endure from the fortunes that crumble, the influence that bends worlds from the influence that fades like mist. It is not the accumulation of wealth that ensures authority. It is the orchestration of dependence. Without it, money is noise. With it, it is the instrument of inevitability. And those who master this truth move unseen through the corridors of ambition, shaping fates, bending wills, constructing realms in the spaces between transactions, silent yet sovereign, because they understand that the coin, in itself, is nothing. What matters is what others cannot live without. What matters is that your hand controls the flow. What matters is that their dependence is your dominion. Dependence is an invisible chain, and those who walk willingly within it are both your subjects and your instruments. Observe the man who borrows, who negotiates, who relies upon your provision. His decisions, once his own, now pivot on your choice, your consent, your acknowledgement. You do not coerce. Coercion is clumsy and fleeting. You create conditions, craft inevitabilities, and allow the world to move as if by its own design, while it flows entirely according to your discretion. The subtlety of influence is greater than the force of armies. It moves in silence, in the unnoticed tightening of circumstance, in the careful calibration of need. Those who understand this principle never appeal to gratitude or fear. Alone, they appeal to reliance. They know that a man who needs cannot act freely against the hand that sustains him. And in this realization lies a power that is at once terrifying and serene, for it requires no spectacle, no dramatics, no threats of violence. It exists in the quiet architecture of provision, in the invisible scaffolding upon which others' lives are built. To wield money without understanding this is to hoard an inert tool. To wield it with this awareness is to bend the currents of human endeavor, to orchestrate compliance, to render desire and necessity indistinguishable from loyalty. The networks of obligation stretch endlessly, and those who master them sit at the center, unseen yet omnipotent, because they have transformed dependence into leverage and leverage into inevitability. Every investment, every payment, every transaction is a gesture of control, a calculation of influence, a deliberate act of shaping reality without confrontation. In the theater of power, appearances matter, but the unseen strings are stronger than the visible hands. Money in itself can be admired, coveted, envied, but it commands nothing. Money in the hands of the man who understands reliance dictates movements, defines priorities, and silently enforces order. The wise do not flaunt wealth, they orchestrate dependence. They understand that the most obedient servants are those who must rely upon their provision, that the most enduring alliances are forged not through friendship or loyalty, but through necessity. And necessity, once understood, becomes a tool more precise than any army, more enduring than any treaty, more binding than any oath. To control how others depend upon you is to write the rules of engagement before a battle begins, to set the terms of negotiation before a word is spoken, to define outcomes while the world believes in the illusion of choice. Observe those who resist. They act independently. They seek alternatives. They look for escape. Observe those who need. Their freedom is limited, their movements predictable, their ambitions quietly aligned with your will. Every provision you withhold or grant, every favor you extend or retract, every opportunity you reveal or conceal, these are instruments of mastery, subtle yet undeniable, shaping decisions, bending intentions, creating patterns invisible to those who refuse to see. Power is not in the accumulation of currency, it is in the orchestration of reliance. A man with gold but no dependence is rich and impotent. A man whose provision others cannot forsake is sovereign even with modest means. This is the calculus of influence, the geometry of control, the architecture of authority. To wield money as an instrument of dependence is to understand human desire, human fear, human ambition, and to arrange them as one arranges pieces on a board, each in its proper place, each contributing to a design that moves according to your vision, invisible yet inexorable. And in this understanding lies the quiet supremacy of the strategist, the unheralded triumph of the architect who knows that the coin is nothing but what the coin commands, the reliance, the need, the inevitability that is everything. Those who fail to grasp this principle mistake abundance for dominance, generosity for power, activity for authority, when in truth only the control of dependence transforms wealth into command, influence into sovereignty, and opportunity into inevitability. The world moves through those who provide and those who need, through those who distribute and those who receive, through those who orchestrate and those who act within their orchestration. To place oneself at the center of such a network, to understand the precise measure of need, to calibrate scarcity and abundance with deliberate intention, this is to wield power with a quiet precision that no force of arms can match, no rhetoric can contest, no loyalty can resist. The most formidable dominion is not announced, not enforced, not celebrated. It is cultivated, designed, and maintained in the shadows of reliance, in the silences between transactions, in the invisible architecture of necessity. Every gesture, every act of provision, every calculated denial becomes a declaration of sovereignty, and the world bends because it cannot exist outside the network you control. The mastery of dependence is the mastery of consequence itself, for those who rely upon you act as extensions of your will, often without recognizing it, often without intention, yet invariably in alignment with the structure you have constructed. Money, then, is not the prize, it is the instrument. Power is not in its possession, it is in the orchestration of dependence it enables. The man who understands this sees beyond the display of wealth, beyond the superficial victories of fortune, beyond the noise of transactions. He sees the pattern, the web, the invisible architecture in which others live, breathe, and move. And by understanding that pattern, by positioning himself at its center, he commands not because he demands obedience, not because he inspires loyalty, not because he threatens reprisal, but because the world itself turns according to his discretion. The tide of necessity, once understood and directed, becomes a silent army, a force both patient and relentless, moving in accordance with the rhythms you have set, bending intentions and shaping outcomes without a single proclamation of authority. To control dependence is to control inevitability. To understand reliance is to wield dominion. To orchestrate need is to move unseen through the corridors of ambition, influence, and survival. And in this quiet, unassailable mastery, money transforms from mere currency into the fulcrum of power, and the man who controls the dependencies of others ascends to a sovereignty that neither applause nor resistance can diminish. The calculus of dependence is subtle, precise, and often invisible to those who do not study the mechanics of human ambition. Observe the institutions, the corporations, the networks of influence that govern our lives. Each functions because of need, because the participants rely upon the structures established by those who control access, and because every choice, every opportunity, every transaction is filtered through the lens of what one cannot obtain independently. To be at the center of such a web is to become indispensable, not by force, not by spectacle, but by necessity, and necessity is a language that all understand, whether they acknowledge it or not. Those who wield this power move quietly, deliberately, measuring every extension of aid, every provision granted, every opportunity revealed or withheld, understanding that the balance of dependence is more potent than fear, more enduring than loyalty, more decisive than alliances formed by words alone. Observe the subtle shifts of compliance. A man alters his path not when commanded, but when the infrastructure of his desires and obligations bends him without resistance. This is the architecture of authority, the invisible dominion forged by those who grasp that money is power only when it structures the dependencies of others. Every favor is a brick in this construction, every loan a beam, every access granted a hinge upon which decisions pivot. And yet, this power is not coercive. It is patient, quiet, remorseless, woven into the fabric of daily transactions until those who are subject to it perceive their dependence not as submission, but as the natural order of existence. To master this is to understand human behavior with surgical precision, to know when to grant, when to withhold, when to extend, when to retract, to observe the subtle tension between desire and necessity, ambition and limitation, freedom and obligation, to recognize that the most profound control is exercised not through fear of reprisal or hope of reward, but through the silent shaping of circumstance, such that those who depend cannot act otherwise without incurring cost, discomfort, or risk. The strategist of dependence is patient, for the tide of necessity does not rush. It rises steadily, imperceptibly, and in its rise, the dependent becomes aligned with the will of the provider without realizing the alignment has occurred. To extend wealth without understanding this is to squander opportunity. To withhold without discretion is to break bonds of influence before they are fully formed. To act with ignorance is to reduce power to currency, and currency to insignificance. The ruler of reliance, the architect of obligation, moves among men as the air moves among leaves, invisible, necessary, shaping the landscape without declaration. The most formidable dominion is built upon this principle, that those who need are governed more surely than those who obey, and that the orchestration of need is an art more precise than the strategies of war, more enduring than the promises of alliances, more silent than the rhetoric of kings. Those who understand this principle see every exchange, every resource, every opportunity not as an end in itself, but as a tool for structuring the dependencies that define influence. They understand that loyalty without necessity is fragile, that gratitude without obligation is fleeting, that obedience without dependence is easily revoked, and they act accordingly, crafting networks, arranging circumstances, aligning desire with provision, until the flow of dependence renders the actions of others predictable, controllable, and advantageous. To command through money is to command the unseen levers of choice, the quiet calculus of need, the silent architecture upon which the lives of others are constructed. It is to occupy the center of a network whose boundaries are invisible yet absolute, whose reach extends through commerce, through ambition, through opportunity, until those who dwell within it act in concert with your discretion, often without awareness, often without intention, yet invariably according to the structure you have imposed. The man who hoards wealth without shaping dependence remains a participant in the world. The man who controls the reliance of others commands it. This is not morality, nor virtue, nor the rhetoric of nobility. It is the raw, precise mechanism of influence, the instrument of power in its most elemental form. Every interaction becomes an opportunity to calibrate reliance, every decision a vector of control, every provision a silent assertion of authority. The dependent does not move freely. He moves within the architecture of necessity, and within that architecture the provider reigns unchallenged, invisible, yet unassailable. To understand and wield this principle is to step beyond the superficialities of wealth, beyond the ostentation of currency, beyond the illusions of generosity or charity, and to perceive the true engine of dominion, the orchestration of human need. Those who resist, who act independently, who seek alternatives, are anomalies, exceptions, but even they are accounted for, measured, anticipated, incorporated into the broader lattice of influence. To be at the center of this lattice is to occupy a position of quiet omnipotence, a dominion without declaration, a sovereignty defined not by the possession of gold alone, but by the structures of necessity in which others move. Money is inert until it structures dependence. Wealth is powerless until it shapes choice. Influence is illusory until it bends will through the architecture of need. And in this truth lies the essence of modern command, not in the accumulation of currency, but in the subtle, remorseless orchestration of reliance, in the quiet construction of networks of necessity, in the patient, deliberate, invisible shaping of circumstance, until the world moves according to the discretion of the unseen hand. The mastery of dependence is a discipline of observation, calculation, and restraint. One must learn to measure the precise point at which a man's need transforms into obedience, to understand the tipping moment when reliance eclipses choice, and to manipulate the intervals between scarcity and provision with deliberate precision. It is not enough to provide. One must provide strategically, aligning the flow of resources with the subtle architecture of influence so that each act of generosity binds, each extension of aid obliges, each denial redirects. The hand that controls the tide need not announce itself, for the current carries those within it effortlessly, and the world bends quietly beneath the weight of structured necessity. Consider the mechanisms of business, politics, social relations. Every opportunity granted, every contract signed, every favor extended is a vector of power, and each must be calibrated to construct a lattice of reliance that is both resilient and invisible. Those who are subject to it believe they act freely, yet their freedom is bounded by the provisions that sustain them, the favors upon which their ambitions rest, the opportunities that cannot exist outside the will of the architect of dependence. The observant strategist notes this, cultivates it, and exploits it without fanfare, understanding that the most potent influence is exercised not through threats or proclamations, but through the quiet shaping of circumstance, the orchestration of necessity, the construction of a reality in which those who move within it cannot act independently without cost, discomfort, or risk. To command in this manner is to achieve inevitability, to render outcomes predictable, to bend human behavior to design without confrontation. Wealth becomes the instrument of power, not through accumulation, but through the patterns of reliance it establishes. Money itself is inert. It is the structure of need, the dependency it produces, and the alignment of desire with provision that transforms currency into dominion. The strategist does not distribute blindly. He measures, times, and directs, knowing that the balance between scarcity and abundance is the lever of obedience, that the provision withheld at the right moment exerts more influence than the provision extended in excess, and that the perception of choice within necessity is a more enduring instrument than compulsion. In the modern world, where armies, treaties, and rhetoric are increasingly ephemeral, the power of structured dependence endures, silent, invisible, and inexorable. Those who recognize this principle rise above the mere possession of wealth. They inhabit the architecture of influence itself, shaping decisions, bending intentions, and orchestrating action without the need for declaration, confrontation, or display. The dependent moves according to the invisible scaffolding you construct, and in this movement lies your sovereignty. Observe the patterns of desire, the vectors of ambition, the thresholds of need, and align them with your discretion. Extend when necessary to bind, withhold when necessary to compel. Calibrate each act so that reliance becomes both natural and indispensable. Those who are free of dependence resist. Those who are bound by it comply, act predictably, and participate willingly in their own subordination, believing it to be freedom, and in this illusion resides your quiet mastery. Every contract, every favor, every opportunity is a brushstroke in the composition of influence. Every gesture, however small, carries weight, bending the currents of human action toward your design. To orchestrate dependence is to orchestrate inevitability, and inevitability is the currency of authority, more durable than fear, more reliable than loyalty, more precise than alliance. Money is not power until it structures reliance. Wealth is not influence until it shapes necessity. Authority is not realized until it occupies the spaces between desire and provision, necessity and choice. The man who understands this principle moves unseen, silent in his dominion, omnipresent in effect, patient in execution, for he knows that time is the ally of structured dependence, that inevitability is built in quiet increments, and that the web of reliance, once woven, endures far beyond the flash of ostentation or the clamor of proclamations. To hold power in this manner is to transcend the superficialities of wealth, to inhabit the unseen mechanisms that govern human behavior, to command not by force but by architecture, not by threat, but by orchestration, not by speech, but by the alignment of need with provision. In this mastery, the world bends not because it is compelled, but because it cannot act otherwise. It moves not because it is instructed, but because its own necessities dictate obedience. It participates willingly in a structure it cannot escape, and within that structure, the architect reigns unseen, remorseless, and absolute. The coin is nothing, the consequence is everything. The flow of dependence is the true measure of dominion, the quiet pulse of authority, the invisible engine upon which the machinery of influence turns. To control it is to move beyond the limitations of wealth into the realm of sovereignty, to occupy a space where outcomes are predictable, where actions are aligned, where inevitability is cultivated without spectacle, and where the hand that guides remains invisible, unchallenged, and unassailable. Those who perceive only the accumulation of gold see wealth. Those who perceive the architecture of reliance see power, and those who wield it understand that money is the instrument, dependence, the medium, and inevitability, the ultimate expression of control. The modern ruler, the strategist, the financier, the architect of influence, all act according to this principle, to structure the world so that others' needs, desires, and ambitions move in alignment with their discretion. And in this alignment, sovereignty is achieved silently, relentlessly, and irrevocably. To grasp this truth is to perceive power as a series of silent currents rather than visible edifices, to see influence as the architecture of necessity rather than the spectacle of command. One must think like a cartographer of obligation, mapping not the surface of transactions, but the deep channels through which dependence flows, noting where desire intersects with limitation, where ambition meets scarcity, where freedom is tethered to provision. Each connection becomes a conduit of control, each favor a mechanism of alignment, each denial a subtle redirection of intent. Observe the human mind. It responds not to abstract authority, but to tangible need, to the structures that enable or constrain, to the pathways that lead towards sustenance, opportunity, and advancement. Those who fail to recognize this expend energy chasing obedience or loyalty as if they were innate qualities, blind to the fact that they are the product of circumstances, molded by the architect of dependence, and maintained by the precision of deliberate provision. To command, therefore, is to engineer those circumstances, to align the lattice of necessity with one's strategic vision, to calibrate every interaction so that the choices available to others naturally incline toward the desired outcome. Timing is as critical as calculation. The same favor extended too soon loses its power, and the same scarcity imposed too long risks rebellion or abandonment. The strategist measures, observes, and intervenes with the patience of the natural world, understanding that the patterns of human behavior respond predictably to the currents of need and opportunity, just as rivers carve predictable channels over time. In this quiet orchestration, the dependent moves with the illusion of autonomy, believing that their actions are free, when in fact each step, each choice, each pursuit is shaped by the invisible scaffolding you have erected. This is the essence of enduring influence, to render action inevitable without ever raising your voice, to guide without appearing to touch, to bind without chains, to lead without declaration. Those who accumulate wealth without constructing dependence are participants in the world. Those who shape reliance command it. To command is not to impose, but to design, to create the conditions under which obedience, alignment, and action arise naturally, and to recognize that true power resides not in possession, but in the orchestration of need. Every resource, every opportunity, every extension of aid becomes a vector through which control is exercised, and every act of withholding becomes a lever by which alignment is secured. Observe the interplay of ambition and limitation. Those who desire will act predictably when their desires are constrained by circumstances only you control, and in this predictability lies authority. The art is in the balance, in knowing how much to extend, how much to withhold, how to time provision so that dependence deepens without resentment, so that alignment occurs without perception, so that the architecture of necessity becomes the invisible skeleton upon which all decisions hang. The silent ruler is the one whose influence is both omnipresent and unseen, whose dominion is exercised through structures rather than spectacle, whose authority is woven into the fabric of daily life without the need for declaration, coercion, or force. Money, position, opportunity, these are inert unless arranged to produce dependence. They are tools, not ends. The architect of influence uses them as instruments to structure behavior, to predict decisions, to cultivate alignment, to generate inevitability. Those who understand this principle do not measure power by the gold they possess, but by the number of choices they control, by the extent to which the currents of human need flow through channels of their making, by the degree to which outcomes can be anticipated, because the lattice of dependence is secure. And in this understanding, one sees that the most enduring sovereignty is silent, patient, invisible, and remorseless, not because it is cruel, but because it is precise, calculated, and attuned to the natural order of human desire and necessity. To occupy this position is to transcend the superficiality of wealth, the spectacle of authority, the rhetoric of command, and to inhabit the machinery of influence itself, to move through the world as both observer and architect, shaping circumstance, aligning intention, and orchestrating action with an economy of gesture until the movement of others becomes an extension of your design. In this orchestration, the dependent is both free and bound. The world appears organic, yet bends inexorably toward your discretion, and the power you wield is measured not in coins, contracts, or titles, but in the invisible, irremovable architecture of reliance that dictates choices and secures inevitability. Every act, every interaction, every transaction is an opportunity to calibrate dependence, to extend alignment, to refine the lattice of influence until the flow of human behavior is predictable, controllable, and advantageous. Those who see only the accumulation of wealth see nothing. Those who perceive the patterns of necessity and desire see power in its purest form, and those who wield it understand that to control how others depend is to command the world without ever touching it, to orchestrate outcomes without confrontation, to exercise sovereignty without display, and to render inevitability the quiet instrument of absolute influence. The mastery of influence through dependence is an exercise in patience and precision, a continual measurement of the human condition and the contingencies of circumstance. Every action, every gift, every restriction is a note in a symphony of control, a deliberate modulation of necessity, a shaping of desire into predictable patterns. One learns to observe not only what men do, but why they do it, tracing the invisible lines that connect longing to limitation, ambition to provision, choice to consequence. In these connections lies the power to anticipate, to guide, to orchestrate without overt force. For those who are subject to reliance act not because they are commanded, but because the architecture of their world allows no other path. Timing and discretion become instruments sharper than swords. An early concession weakens, a delayed extension strengthens. A measured withdrawal compels more than coercion. A strategic provision secures more than praise. The dependent believes in the autonomy of their actions, yet their autonomy is bounded, their freedom channeled, their outcomes guided by the invisible hand that aligns necessity with decision. To structure dependence is to render the behavior of others inevitable without confrontation, to construct a lattice of obligation so subtle that those ensnared within it move willingly, convinced they act freely. Wealth, position, opportunity, they are inert until they are arranged to produce reliance, until they are deployed with foresight, until they become instruments of necessity. The strategist of dependence recognizes that loyalty is ephemeral unless reinforced by need, that gratitude fades without obligation, that obedience is fragile without aligned desire. Thus, every provision is measured, every denial calculated, every engagement designed to deepen reliance and sculpt choice. The web of dependence is invisible, yet absolute. Its threads are constructed through countless small interactions, each reinforcing the architecture of control, each bending human action toward the discretion of the architect. Those who amass wealth without understanding this principle wield power only as long as the currency itself is in demand. Those who construct reliance command the currents of action, shaping outcomes and bending intentions with a quiet, remorseless authority. Observe the interplay of scarcity and abundance. Necessity moves men more predictably than fear, and alignment through desire is more enduring than allegiance born of rhetoric. The flow of dependence is continuous, imperceptible, and inexorable. Those who exist within it act within its constraints, believing in their freedom, unaware that each step, each choice, each pursuit is directed by the careful design of the strategist. To command thus is to achieve inevitability without spectacle, to guide without coercion, to lead without declaration, to reign without proclamation. The invisible ruler occupies the nexus of provision and need, of ambition and limitation, of desire and scarcity, and within that nexus, sovereignty is exercised with precision, patience, and remorseless clarity. Money is powerless until it structures choice. Wealth is inert until it constructs dependence. Authority is unrealized until it occupies the space between necessity and decision. To perceive this is to perceive the engine of influence itself, to inhabit the architecture of power rather than its superficialities, to move through the world as both observer and designer, shaping circumstance, calibrating reliance, and orchestrating outcomes until the currents of human behavior flow according to one's discretion. Every interaction, every transaction, every gesture is an opportunity to reinforce the lattice, to deepen alignment, to refine the architecture of control until the dependent acts predictably, the willing comply without recognition, and the inevitability of the strategist's design manifests silently, steadily, and absolutely. Those who measure only currency see wealth, those who measure the patterns of reliance see power, and those who wield it with understanding know that to control how others depend is to exercise dominion without confrontation, to orchestrate outcomes without declaration, to render influence invisible yet total, and to ensure that inevitability itself becomes the quiet, unassailable instrument of command. Power is the silent accumulation of influence, the patient orchestration of circumstance, the deliberate structuring of need, so that freedom itself bends toward design. To wield it is to think like a natural force, to perceive the contours of human desire, to measure the thresholds of necessity, to align ambition with the provisions only you control. The dependent acts as though by choice, yet every movement is directed by the lattice of reliance you construct, every pursuit guided by the channels of opportunity you permit. One must understand the rhythms of scarcity and abundance, the cadence of expectation, the invisible pressure points where intervention will bend outcome without resistance. The hand that controls need not strike. It need only shape the world so that those within it cannot act outside the perimeter of dependence without cost, discomfort, or uncertainty. Observe the human condition. Ambition is predictable when constrained, desire is pliable when limited, and action is inevitable when provision and necessity are aligned. Wealth is transformed into power only when it constructs these invisible channels, when every coin, every favor, every opportunity becomes a lever through which human behavior can be guided, anticipated, and orchestrated. To extend too much is to weaken, to withhold too long is to risk rebellion, and to act without calculation is to surrender the advantage that patience and precision confer. The strategist moves silently, observing, measuring, waiting, intervening only where it will bend the currents of behavior with minimal effort and maximum effect. The dependent does not recognize the architecture in which they exist. They move freely within it, yet their freedom is bounded by the patterns of reliance you impose. This is the essence of durable authority, to shape outcomes without spectacle, to command without declaration, to occupy the invisible spaces between desire and provision, ambition and limitation, necessity and choice. Every act of giving, every extension of aid, Every restriction imposed is a deliberate stroke upon the canvas of influence, each calculated to deepen alignment, ensure predictability, and cultivate inevitability. Those who possess wealth but fail to structure dependence wield power that is ephemeral, fragile, subject to fluctuation and challenge. Those who construct reliance wield influence that is invisible, enduring, and absolute. To command thus is to transcend the superficialities of possession, to inhabit the machinery of human behavior itself, to orchestrate circumstance so that outcomes become natural, movement predictable, and obedience voluntary yet inescapable. Money is inert. It is the structure of dependence, the alignment of need with provision, the orchestration of scarcity and abundance that converts it into dominion. Observe, measure, calibrate, and intervene with precision. Each interaction a mechanism, each engagement a lever, each concession a tool to shape the currents of action. The dependent acts within the perimeter of design, believing in autonomy, yet guided invisibly by the strategist who understands the true currency of power. Authority is exercised not through spectacle or proclamation, but through patience, calculation, and the quiet construction of inevitability. To master this is to command the modern world not through force, but through alignment, not through rhetoric, but through architecture, not through threat, but through orchestration. Those who perceive only accumulation see wealth. Those who perceive the currents of reliance see power, and those who wield it understand that control over dependence is the ultimate instrument of sovereignty, precise, invisible, unassailable, and eternal. To command through dependence is to inhabit the space between desire and provision, to construct the channels through which human action flows, to measure the elasticity of ambition, and to calibrate the pressure of necessity so that movement becomes inevitable. One observes the patterns of expectation, the cadence of need, the subtle inclinations that shape choice, and intervenes only where the currents of behavior require direction. Wealth without structure is a river without banks, its flow dispersed, its potential for control dissipated. Dependence gives it channel, current, and force. The strategist understands that every provision extended carries weight beyond its material value, that every denial imposes leverage, and that the timing of each act determines the depth of influence it will generate. To act without calculation is to surrender the quiet authority that arises when need and opportunity intersect within boundaries only you define. The dependent believes in the autonomy of their decisions, yet their actions are shaped by the lattice of necessity you have erected, every choice guided by invisible architecture, every pursuit constrained by circumstance you control. To construct this lattice requires patience, observation, and precision, a continual adjustment to the rhythms of human ambition and the thresholds of necessity, ensuring that the flow of action bends toward design rather than chance. The visible accumulation of wealth, position, or opportunity is meaningless unless it is arranged to generate reliance. It is the alignment of provision with dependency that transforms assets into instruments of command. Scarcity and abundance, limitation and opportunity, reward and restraint, all are tools in the quiet orchestration of behavior, each applied with strategic purpose, each modulated to cultivate predictability, alignment, and inevitability. Those who wield power through this understanding do not coerce. They guide, they shape, they structure the environment so that choices conform to intention, outcomes arise naturally from design, and compliance is voluntary, yet inescapable. The architecture of dependence is invisible, yet total. Its threads are woven through countless interactions, each reinforcing control, each bending human action toward the discretion of the strategist. The master of influence understands that loyalty is fragile unless supported by need, that obedience is ephemeral without alignment, and that desire is predictable when constrained within channels constructed by precise calculation. To extend too much is to dilute authority. To withhold too long is to provoke rebellion. To act impulsively is to forfeit advantage. Thus, the strategist measures, waits, and intervenes only where effect will be absolute and minimal effort required. Wealth, opportunity, and favor become levers of influence when arranged to produce dependence, channels through which human behavior can be guided, anticipated, and orchestrated without overt force. Those who perceive only possessions see nothing. Those who perceive the currents of reliance see power. Those who wield it understand that to control how others depend is to occupy the invisible, unassailable center of authority, commanding outcomes without spectacle, orchestrating action without declaration, rendering inevitability itself the instrument of sovereignty. Every gesture, every transaction, every act of provision or denial becomes a tool to refine the lattice, deepen alignment, and secure predictability, until the flow of human behavior conforms silently, steadily, and inexorably to design. In this quiet mastery, freedom is bounded yet unrecognized, choice is guided yet voluntary, and the strategist moves through the world as both observer and architect, shaping circumstance, calibrating dependence, and orchestrating inevitability with patient, remorseless precision. Money is inert, influence is not. Wealth is a tool, dependence is power. To master it is to command without force, to align without speech, to shape outcomes without declaration, and to render the currents of human behavior the quiet instrument of absolute authority, precise, invisible, and enduring. The strategist of dependence moves in silence, perceiving the contours of human desire and the patterns of necessity as a map to be read and rewritten at will. Each interaction is a measurement, each concession a lever, each restriction a vector through which behavior is guided. Those who appear free are in truth constrained by the architecture you construct. Their choices, their ambitions, their movements bend subtly yet inexorably to the currents of reliance you orchestrate. The careful calibration of scarcity and abundance, of opportunity and limitation, creates predictability where once there was uncertainty, alignment where once there was dissent, inevitability where once there was chance. Wealth, without this architecture, is raw and untamed. Power, without the guidance of dependence, is a fleeting shadow. To extend favor is to bind. To withhold is to compel. To provide selectively is to direct without declaration. Timing is the instrument through which influence resonates. A gesture made too early diminishes authority. A delay that tests patience reinforces it. A measured withdrawal imposes a discipline more potent than coercion. One observes, measures, and intervenes, aware that human action follows desire constrained by circumstance, that every ambition has its limits, every aspiration its predictable pathways. The dependent moves through a world designed to shape them, believing themselves autonomous, unaware that the lattice of reliance delineates the scope of their freedom, channels their choices, and structures the outcomes they pursue. This is the architecture of enduring power, invisible, patient, precise, remorseless, unbroken in its logic, absolute in its reach. Every act of provision is calculated to reinforce alignment. Every denial is designed to deepen dependence. Every engagement is orchestrated to produce predictability. Those who wield wealth without understanding this principle are participants in the theater of fortune, vulnerable to the fluctuations of circumstance. Those who structure dependence command the currents of human behavior, steering outcomes, shaping choices, and producing inevitability without the need for display. Observe the interplay of desire and limitation. Ambition constrained by necessity is predictable. Desire tempered by scarcity is malleable, and action guided by provision becomes inevitable. To master this is to inhabit the machinery of influence, to become both architect and observer, to design circumstances in which outcomes are natural, compliance is voluntary, and sovereignty is exercised without spectacle. Money is the instrument, dependence is the medium, and influence is the effect. Every transaction, every gesture, every strategic act of giving or withholding becomes a tool to refine the lattice, deepen alignment, and orchestrate inevitability. The dependent acts within the perimeter of your design, believing in autonomy, yet their actions conform to the structure you have constructed. Authority is exercised not through proclamation or coercion, but through patient calculation, subtle architecture, and the precise orchestration of need. Those who perceive only accumulation see wealth. Those who perceive the patterns of reliance see power. Those who wield it understand that to control how others depend is to command without confrontation, to shape outcomes without declaration, to render influence invisible, total, and enduring. In this quiet mastery, freedom is bounded yet unrecognized. Choice is guided yet voluntary, and the strategist moves through the currents of human action with the precision, patience, and remorseless clarity of inevitability itself. The lattice of dependence is everywhere, yet unseen. It binds without chains, directs without decree, and ensures that the flow of human behavior aligns perfectly with design. To master it is to occupy the central, unassailable seat of power, to orchestrate circumstance, to calibrate ambition, to shape desire, and to render inevitability the quiet, unbroken instrument of absolute influence. Every extension of aid, every calculated restriction, every interaction is a brushstroke in the architecture of control, a deliberate shaping of human action, a patient cultivation of reliance that transforms wealth into power, provision into authority, and inevitability into sovereignty. Those who understand this wield influence not through force but through design, not through command but through structure, not through spectacle but through the invisible architecture of dependence, precise, remorseless, and eternal. Control is neither loud nor ostentatious. It is quiet, meticulous, and unrelenting. The dependent moves believing in freedom, yet their every action is a thread in the lattice the strategist has woven, each decision bending to the architecture of reliance, each pursuit constrained by channels designed with foresight. One learns to measure the subtle pressures that guide ambition, the invisible levers that bend desire, the thresholds of need that shape behavior, and to intervene only where a gentle nudge produces inevitability. Wealth becomes inert unless it structures necessity. Authority remains fragile unless it aligns provision with dependence. Influence is fleeting unless it occupies the space between opportunity and obligation. The strategist observes the flow of human intent, mapping the predictable currents of want and limitation, desire and scarcity, action and consequence, and then designs circumstances in which movement is inevitable, compliance voluntary, and outcome certain. Timing is the silent instrument of dominance. A favor extended prematurely may weaken authority. A withheld opportunity can compel alignment. A selective provision guides choice more powerfully than any command. Each interaction becomes a mechanism to deepen alignment, to refine the architecture of dependence, to ensure that the currents of behavior conform to design. The dependent believes they navigate freely, yet their freedom is bounded by the channels you create, and within those bounds, their actions become predictable, their choices constrained, their loyalty and ambition molded without resistance. The master of influence constructs these channels with patience, observation, and calculation, understanding that loyalty without necessity is fleeting, obedience without alignment is brittle, and desire untethered by dependence is unreliable. Every coin, every opportunity, every resource is a lever to shape action. Every limitation, every withdrawal, every measured delay is a tool to reinforce alignment. Those who possess wealth but fail to understand its role in constructing dependence wield power only as long as the currency itself commands attention. Those who orchestrate reliance command currents invisible yet absolute, bending circumstance, guiding choice, and producing inevitability with quiet precision. Scarcity and abundance, reward and restraint, provision and denial, all are instruments of authority, applied judiciously to cultivate predictability, reinforce alignment, and sustain sovereignty. The strategist inhabits the invisible spaces between desire and provision, ambition and limitation, freedom and necessity, operating as both observer and architect, sculpting human behavior without spectacle, commanding outcomes without proclamation, shaping action with deliberate, remorseless calculation. Money is inert. It becomes potent only when it structures choice, orchestrates reliance, and channels ambition. Power is exercised not through display or coercion, but through architecture, timing, and understanding of the human condition. To master this is to command the currents of behavior invisibly, to align ambition with necessity, to guide desire without declaration, and to ensure that inevitability itself becomes the instrument of authority. Every interaction, every engagement, every act of giving or withholding is a calculated move within the lattice of dependence, reinforcing alignment, deepening reliance, and securing predictability. The dependent acts within the perimeter of design, believing in autonomy, yet every movement is guided by invisible architecture, every choice bounded by circumstance, every pursuit shaped by necessity. Authority is exercised not through spectacle or coercion, but through patient calculation, subtle orchestration, and the precise structuring of need. Those who perceive only accumulation see wealth. Those who perceive the architecture of reliance see power. Those who wield it understand that to control how others depend is to command without confrontation, to shape outcomes without declaration, to render influence invisible, absolute, and enduring. The lattice of dependence extends unseen, binding without chains, directing without decree, ensuring that human behavior flows perfectly into the currents of design. To master it is to inhabit the center of influence, to orchestrate circumstance, to calibrate desire, to shape ambition, and to render inevitability the quiet, unbroken instrument of sovereignty. Every extension of aid, every calculated restriction, every interaction is a deliberate act in the architecture of control, transforming wealth into power, provision into authority, and reliance into the mechanism of absolute influence. Those who understand this wield dominion not through force, but through design, not through command, but through structure, not through spectacle, but through the invisible channels of dependence, precise, remorseless, and eternal. And so, the truth reveals itself. Power is never granted, it is constructed. It is not the accumulation of coin or title that secures dominion, but the deliberate orchestration of need, the patient shaping of dependence, the quiet architecture through which human behavior bends with inevitability. Those who chase wealth for display alone find themselves at the mercy of circumstance, their influence ephemeral, their authority fragile, their sovereignty a reflection of fortune rather than mastery. The master, by contrast, understands the invisible mechanics. Every act of provision is a lever, every denial a vector, every gesture a thread in the lattice that binds without chains, guides without proclamation, and compels without confrontation. Dependence is the currency of true power. Control over it is absolute, unassailable, and enduring. To command it is to move unseen, to operate as architect and observer, to shape desire, calibrate ambition, and orchestrate outcomes until inevitability itself becomes the instrument of sovereignty. And in this quiet mastery lies the deepest paradox. The dependent believes in freedom even as their choices are guided, ambition flows even as it is constrained, and loyalty is offered even as it is compelled. The strategist does not boast, does not threaten, does not seek applause. They inhabit the space where action becomes predictable, where opportunity is aligned with necessity, where human behavior conforms to design. Money alone is inert. It is the channels it constructs, the reliance it secures, the inevitability it imposes that transform it into dominion. And so the ruler, the master of influence, moves through the world as both shadow and architect, patient and precise, observing, measuring, intervening only when effect is absolute. Every interaction, every provision, every restriction is part of a vast, invisible machinery, shaping outcomes, aligning desire, cultivating obedience, and ensuring that the currents of human action bend silently to design. Those who perceive only wealth see the surface. Those who perceive the lattice of reliance see the currents of power. Those who wield it understand that to control how others depend is to command without spectacle, to direct without decree, to orchestrate inevitability itself. And when the threads are fully woven, when the channels of reliance are complete, when every gesture and choice falls within the architecture of design, there emerges a quiet, remorseless dominion, unseen, unchallenged, absolute. This is the final lesson, the enduring truth of authority in a fractured world. Money is power, but only when it governs dependence. Wealth is influence, but only when it bends desire. Provision is sovereignty, but only when it shapes inevitability. To understand this is to command not through force, not through rhetoric, but through the invisible mastery of circumstance, the deliberate shaping of human action, and the quiet, unbroken orchestration of the currents that make the world yield to design. In the end, the strategist stands alone, not because they wield more coin, but because they have understood the profound mechanics of reliance, the silent architecture of influence, and the inexorable truth. To control how others depend is to hold dominion over the currents of life itself, precise, remorseless, eternal.